There is some conversation around the idea that a lot of the capital ratios are based on what they call risk-weighted assets. So basically, you're taking the assets and based on what they're invested in, what kind of loans they are, they count different ways, and you've got all this weightings, and it's all churned through, and you've got the sausage maker, and at the end you have this number that says, okay, well here's your Basel III Tier 1 capital ratio. And so people are saying, well, if you weight something a different way, you make it look more favorable, so maybe this doesn't really mean that banks are safer. But I think if you look at leverage ratios, if you look at actual common equity versus the assets on the books, could the banks be safer and hold more capital? Of course, they always could. You're always going to be walking some line between keeping the banks safe and allowing them to be able to lend, which is good for the banks, good for the bank's investors, but also is needed in the economy. I mean, the other side of this equation is that banks are lending out to businesses so that they can build new facilities, so that they can buy capital equipment, so that they could hire people. They're lending out to consumers so that they can buy homes, so that they can get credit cards and they can buy TVs and food and all that kind of stuff. But I mean, it is that balance between we want the banks to be safe, but we also want them to be able to lend. So that is a conversation going on. Another conversation going on, continues to go on, is the whole too big to fail thing. And that it's an interesting conversation. On the one hand, you can say that you can look back at the financial crisis and say, oh, hey, look at all the government and taxpayer money that had to go towards these banks because they were too big to fail. And that's certainly not an ideal situation to be in. But the U.S. is actually a fairly unusual country in terms of the banking regime. We have thousands of banks all over the country. Very, very large banks. We have small banks. We have medium-sized banks. If you look at other countries, there are far fewer banks. And usually they are very large, basically too big to fail banks. Canada's a good example of that. Germany's like that. And so the idea of having really big banks that you can't have fail works elsewhere. But we kind of need to figure out how that works in our system. I don't think we're quite there yet. Is the answer breaking up the biggest banks? I don't know. I don't think so. There are certain efficiencies that do come with being a very large bank. Obviously, there are dangers that come along with it too. I think it may be more an idea of limiting growth, limiting size, or limiting certain business functions.